Order. Welcome to this afternoon's session of the Energy Security and Net Zero Select Committee. And with the events in the Middle East, the issue of energy security is clearly of great interest, and we will be addressing it shortly. But welcome to our panel today, who are here to talk about the cost of energy, which equally will be very relevant given what has happened in the Middle East. I'll ask the panel to introduce yourselves, and then we're going to ask for a short statement from the Chair of Ofgem about what is happening. So please, on this side.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Akshay, Kaul. I'm Director General for Infrastructure at Ofgem.
Jonathan Brearley, CEO of Ofgem.
Fintan, Slye, CEO, National Energy System Operator.
And Claire Dykta, Director of Strategy and Policy at the National Energy System Operator.
Jonathan, CEO. Apologies. It's been a long week already. Thank you very much for offering to make a statement. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. And naturally, there is a lot of concern around the situation in the Middle East, including the potential impact on consumers here. So I'd like to start by saying our thoughts and deepest sympathies are with everyone involved and those who have been affected. Now, I also know that many families and businesses will also be concerned about the impact this conflict will have on energy bills. And clearly, as we saw in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, our gas supply cannot be separated from global events. It's important to make clear that our energy supplies remain secure. Britain continues to benefit from a diverse gas supply, which provides the market with the flexibility it needs in times of disruption. In the short term, until the end of June, customers will be on fixed tariffs or protected by the price cap. Although we remain at the early stages of this conflict, if the Strait of Hormuz remains closed for a prolonged period of time, it is likely that this will create significant upward pressure on prices that customers will pay for their gas and electricity. For example, in electricity, gas still sets the price for the majority of the time. Now, I know already there is a great deal of speculation about the scale and extent of those price changes, but genuinely it is too early to tell. In my experience, gas traders find it extremely difficult to calibrate the sorts of risks we are facing, and therefore market projections are not a reliable guide to the future. Examining the impacts for the energy sector, I would say that we are in a significantly stronger position than we were in 2021. Suppliers are more financially resilient with a significantly lower risk of failure, and the price cap is already more adaptable to changing market conditions. We have regular monitoring of the market conditions and will increase the intensity of this as the situation evolves. Equally, we have improved standards of care for customers and continue to work to improve supplier treatment of those in debt and hope to introduce our debt relief scheme imminently. At the end of this week, I will be meeting supplier CEOs, and we will maintain close contact with the industry and with consumer groups to surface and quickly address any unforeseen and unintended consequences. Finally, I welcome this committee's investigation into the costs of energy, and I know that we will debate non-commodity costs. But this week's events demonstrate to me that it is vital that we diversify our risk away from over-reliance on the international gas markets and continue to work strategically to provide a more stable place for the energy bills for British households and businesses. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Jonathan, my colleagues may well have their own questions. Ed, you talked about the price cap protecting customers until the end of June. Ed Davey quoted a figure in Prime Minister's questions of an increase in the price cap of £500. Can you just reassure that this is not where we're going to be in the short term at the very least?
Well, I think to be really clear, we know what the price will be until the end of June because the price cap was announced recently, and we know that that is a reduction on where it was before. But it is simply too early to tell where prices will go. A lot of that depends on the scale and duration of the interruptions and the ability of the gas market to recover. So I know there's lots of speculation out there about what might happen. Genuinely, I believe it's too early to tell.
Thank you. And the Chancellor's meeting the industry, the representatives of North Sea operators this afternoon. They may be doing this as we meet, and something that again has been raised by quite a few people is whether North Sea production can be used in the short term to increase our supply and maintain our prices of gas. Can you just address those points?
Ultimately, what we do with the North Sea is a matter for ministers, but it is very hard to see, certainly in the short term, that any change in North Sea production would have a big impact on international prices. Ultimately, this price is set globally, and it depends on big global dynamics. So therefore, big geopolitical changes like Russia, Ukraine, or indeed like what we're seeing in the Middle East are the things that are driving the sorts of spikes that we see.
You said in the short term, is it possible in the long term to affect?
Well, I think we've got to accept that, even if we ramped up production in the North Sea, I don't see a huge impact on the international price unless somehow we ring-fenced our market from others. But the fact is we will always need to import, so I'm not sure I see how that works.
Right, thanks very much. And you talked about diversifying our risk away from over-reliance on international markets. Is that another way of saying that the energy transition is very much in our interests, and that's what the current crisis and indeed Ukraine have highlighted?
Well, of course, there's the big political debate I know about the scale and pace and how we diversify. But I think we are seeing again the impacts of being over-reliant on one source of fuel. Therefore, the transition we are on has the advantage of allowing us to have a more stable place when we get there.
Yeah, and Fintan, any comment on the points that I've just discussed with Jonathan?
No, I mean, I suppose the point I would make as well, though, is that just to reassure the committee and people that security our energy supplies in Great Britain remain secure, both in terms of gas and electricity margins are adequate and in line with what we would expect at this time. I think the impact of the price rises in wholesale gas that we're seeing will take time to bleed through into bills, as Jonathan said. So I think it depends, I would agree, on how long that lasts. But I think the point is well made that diversification away from gas and the fact that that is set on international global markets does provide a degree of protection to customers in Great Britain.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a lot of people want to ask questions on this. Lizzie, Colin.
Actually, Sharon, I think you've covered it.
Been covered. Okay, Melanie was the next person.
Oh, thank you. In your statement, Jonathan, you said that gas still sets the price for electricity the majority of the time. My question really is why? If renewables went over 50% of UK delivery in 2024, and if we include other low carbon measures like nuclear power, that takes us up to 60%. So why are we still stuck with electricity being pegged to gas?
So, when you look at the dynamics in the wholesale market, in effect what sets the price is the marginal plant. So it's the plant that's at the top of the stack for the demand we have for that day. And very often that remains
It's done
gas.
on a daily basis. Is this
So
assessment done on a daily basis?
So it's done more frequently than that. So
Right.
it's done I think, half-hourly, basically. So it's done in a very short term. Now, for some of that plant, so for plant that is new in renewables, contracts for difference, in effect, the difference is repaid back to customers, but we still have a lot of legacy renewable plant on a system that was designed to be a top-up over and above the market price. So that plant, plus the gas plant we have in the market, are still costing customers more than it should. Over time, as we build out more renewables, we'll be in a different place, and they will start becoming the marginal plant, and that will change.
When do you think that will be? My final question on that.
So I think we have NESO said by 2030. What was our figure for that?
So by 2030, gas will only be 5% of the mix. I think
Will it definitely, given grid connections, given constraints, we're all going to go on and talk about those things, but will it be?
So, I mean, the challenge to get to clean power by 2030 is a huge challenge, right, and requires, we use the term a Herculean effort right across the industry to deliver it, and we can happily delve into the elements of it, but real good progress has been made across that. And undoubtedly gas by 2030 will be significantly less than it is today in terms of part of the fuel mix. But the other element of changing how that feeds through into prices is the reformed national pricing programme that government is launching, which is around how do you change the market rules and the way prices are set such that that is fit for the future and fit for purpose. I think what we have at the moment is a market mechanism and a market design that was built for a different era, and we need to transform that, and that is what's termed the Reform National Pricing Programme. So both the change in physical mix but also the change in the market rules as to how that feeds through are important.
Thank you.
You're getting into some of the questions we were going to come to later, but it's a very, very interesting point. I'm tempted to say, and I will say, as you talked about the Reform National Pricing approach, can you explain what it is?
Yes. So Reform National Pricing is the market design programme that is that was born out of what was previously the Review of Electricity Market Arrangements, or the REMA programme, where government looked at how the wholesale price should be set. Should it be a national price or a zonal price? So in the middle of last year, government took a policy decision that it should be that the basic wholesale pricing mechanism should be a single wholesale price, and that a programme should be launched to work to follow that up around, well, what are the changes that we then need to make in order to ensure that that is efficient, ensures security of supply, and delivers value for customers. So it is a holistic market design programme launched on foot of the decision to retain a single wholesale national price for electricity. And it has a number of strands, some of which are being led by DESNES from a policy perspective, some of which are settlement and billing type changes, which will be led by NESO, and some of them are transmission charging work streams, which will be led by Ofgem.
And Chair, I understand that the Reform National Pricing Delivery Plan will be published by the Department in due course. No more dates than that.
That's sooner or later than imminent.
So wonderfully reassuring. To tell us that. What do you mean by Fintan, though, by settlement and billing? Or is it too early to say?
So we published a few weeks ago a call for input setting out what some of the potential changes that you could make to settlement and billing arrangements in the system. So it includes things like, should you have a shorter settlement period, for example? So should you change how different types of technologies bid into the market? So it's a number of changes. At the moment, we're just at the call for input stage. So we've sort of set out a few ideas and are looking for industry input into that.
And presumably the intention is for both business and domestic consumers to have access to electricity when it's cheap. Have I got that right? Is that the essence of it, or one of the essence?
That is absolutely one of the essence, and some of the reforms that we're proposing allow for and facilitate much smaller players down to potentially batteries and houses being able to participate in the markets and to sort of leverage those assets in a way that they can minimise their bills as well. Yeah, that is a core part of it.
Right, thank you, which we will learn more about in due course then. I'll go to Graham first and then to you, Sir Christopher.
Thank you, Chair. Jonathan, just to go back to your statement at the beginning, there was a couple of in due course, shall I say, type phrases that I just wanted to explore gently. First of all, is a prolonged period of time of the Straits of Hormuz being closed. I've read some analysis that suggests 2 weeks is a period that would be manageable, but anything beyond that could start to have an impact. So I wonder if you could just expand a little bit on what your interpretation of prolonged period of time is. And similarly, you talk about monitoring of market conditions and increasing the intensity of monitoring. How do you increase intensity of monitoring beyond some really good Google searches? So what do you mean by monitoring market conditions, and how does that happen?
So both things. I mean, on the impact of the Straits of Hormuz, I mean, I have heard, but this is only in conversation with traders, there was a sort of assumption around 2 weeks, and that is what was playing into the price increases we've seen today. I'm afraid we have not got analysis that says if that's a month, if that's 3 or 4 months, what that might mean. What we are beginning to do, which is what we did in the crisis, is begin to look at sort of base case, best case and worst case. And you've got to play into that all sorts of other geopolitical events that might happen. Now, we haven't got anything ready, but we're happy to come back and talk about that when we see it.
At what point do you think it will create the significant upward pressure that you refer to in your statement?
So we are already seeing the wholesale market increase. That will feed through ultimately to the next round of the price cap. But at the moment, it's not a black or white answer. So this will be a graduation. My point is really simple. Anyone who's drawing a line from the price today and saying that's what's going to happen on the price cap, I don't think that's robust because this is moving too fast. And look, on intensity monitoring, I will be clearer. So we have regular updates on the financial situation of the suppliers. We are already contacting each supplier to make sure we understand exactly what is happening to them as a result of this. And that's all part of the framework we put in after the Russia-Ukraine crisis to monitor resilience.
So it's increasing the contact with suppliers.
And the information we get from them.
Right,
yes.
that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Sir Christopher.
So the consumer and industrial pain is going to be deferred as a result of what you're saying, because unlike, for example, the petrol pumps, the prices is directly reflecting changes in market conditions. But what you're saying is that you're going to prevent the energy companies responding with the price mechanism towards consumers immediately because of the price cap. Is that right?
Well, in a sense, that is right. We are the price cap by its nature defers the impacts for customers, but it's important to understand how energy companies trade behind that. So energy companies buy forward based on the price cap formula. So what we ask of companies is to be largely majority hedged against what their customer base on the standard variable tariff have. So in a sense, they are paying roughly what is charged in the price cap. It's just that they are buying the energy forward, which is what we'd rather have than simply buying on the spot market.
So I'm told that a cargo of liquefied natural gas from the United States a fortnight ago would cost about $25 million delivered to Europe, and that now that cost is about $50 million delivered to Europe. So are you saying that the energy companies should not be buying at that price, or are you going to, in a sense, insulate them against those prices with a cost plus structure? So whatever their costs are, you're going to be able to allow those costs to be recovered from consumers.
So for the gas that most companies have bought today, for their customers who are on the price cap, they will have hedged that, they will have bought that, in effect, forward 3 months ago. So the price they pay will have been set 3 months ago, so I guess it would be closer to your $25 million that you described previously. The companies all hedge against the price cap formula, which asks them basically to buy it in advance. That means this impact doesn't go away, you're right, but it does mean that will feed through to the forward buying they will be doing for when that price cap changes. So I don't think right now, you have some problems at the margins, absolutely, but right now the disparity between a well-hedged company and what they get through the price back shouldn't be high, except for one sort of big differential, which is where the volumes that customers end up using are different from their projections. So one of the things you look for example, are there big changes in the weather which would drive that other way?
And how confident are you that all the major players in the industry have got themselves insulated by having long-term contracts? Because that was the problem last time, yes. That other companies went bust and the taxpayer ended up bailing them out. So can you assure us that that's not going to happen again?
So we monitor very closely. We have two things that we didn't have in 2021. We monitor very closely that hedging strategy, so they are vast majority hedged, and we also monitor the amount of capital they need to hold to make sure they have an insurance against something like this. Now, the sector is on a journey. It's not in the perfect place, and we've been very open about that in our reporting and indeed at this committee. However, it's a much more robust place than it was before. The one thing I do need to emphasise, though, is we're not designing a zero failure regime. So we are also very cognizant that if we tighten those regulations too much, we simply don't have diversity and competition in the market. So there's always a balance. And we can't ever offer any guarantees, even if last sort of month, the weekend and Monday hadn't happened. We can't offer guarantees there'll be no failures, but we're in a much stronger position.
And what can you do to stop profiteering? Because obviously, if I've hedged and I've got my supply for $25 million instead of $50 million, I could go out and sell that in a subsidiary market now and make the profits for my company, and then will I be able to pass on those costs ultimately to the consumer through the price cap?
Well, in a sense, there is always trading around around the margins of what your customers need, but you are obliged to provide your customers under the contracts you have with them. I think the major profiteering in the industry is not in the retail market. I think the retail market, ultimately we set a regulated return. The market has been at or below that in the last few years. What we do know is that those people that bring the gas out the ground, so the explorers and the gas explorers and the people who get the gas out the ground, are the ones where the big profits are made, and that's not something that Ofgem regulates.
My final point. So we've seen the lists showing that we've got the highest electricity prices both for industrial users and consumers in Europe. Do you think because of the way in which our market is regulated that we will now see that our prices for consumers will be below the highest levels in Europe, both for industrial and domestic consumers?
The reason we have higher industrial prices in other countries, and it does vary, is principally the level at which our economy depends on gas and the fact that we're investing in our infrastructure to change it, including network costs. So if the gas price goes up, I suspect that we will continue to pay relatively high prices. The reason why I argue for diversity, and I know there's a debate in this committee about what we should diversify to, is because I think at the moment we are attached too much to a market that has been incredibly volatile. And the new reality we have to face is that the geopolitical situation we have now means we can't have confidence in the forward prices that were published last week, where everyone was telling me gas prices were low, because things change quickly. So no one's arguing against using gas. We need gas as part of our system. But what we are saying is we think we need to diversify away from that.
So the companies that have hedged successfully against this sort of price hike, they will be able to take that benefit for themselves rather than have to pass it on to the consumer.
Well, they will still need to provide that energy for their customers. So they still need to pass it to their customers. So only around the margins, if it's a warmer day and they have less power than they need or less gas than they need.
Okay.
Thank you. Claire?
So I just want to follow up on this business where you're saying the retailers are both not where you think the profiteering is, but also they have hedged against it by their forward pricing. So what is the knock-on impact then beyond them in the market? Because is our price cap mechanism in isolation not significant enough to have an effect on that wider international market?
So just looking at our experience through 21 and 22, our market is not significant enough to, I think, materially change the time basis of the energy market internationally. But there are some concerns that were raised that what you do is you concentrate British trading at a certain point in time. So if you go back 5 or 10 years, different companies would have different hedging strategies. They'd have different products they're buying over different times. For domestic customers, that is all concentrated around 3 months. Now, I don't think that'll be an issue at the scale and pace we're seeing at the moment, but that was something we were aware of and the consequential impacts on the wholesale markets when we went through this in 22.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Well, you've been talking about network costs, and I have some questions about non-commodity costs next for you, Jonathan and Akshay. We heard from Rachel Fletcher of Octopus Energy that non-commodity costs are adding up about £300 of pressure onto a typical bill. She questioned whether the investment or the expansion or the upgrades of the network were actually necessary, and claimed that networks are massively underutilised and that demand has been falling for the last decade or so. She wasn't the only person to make that point to the committee, and there is massive uncertainty about how quickly demand will increase. Does she have a point?
I think on electricity demand, it is true that demand has been falling from 2005 to 2025. There was a secular decline because of energy efficiency of the economy, but that has recently reversed. So we are now seeing a growth in electricity demand being driven by the take-up of electrification of heat and transport technologies. What I would say is that is in the main an issue when we think about the economics of the distribution grid. I think when you're talking about transmission for now, the big story on transmission is that we are building a lot of renewable generation up in the north and the east in particular, offshore, and that power has to be brought into the cities. And if we don't build the network to connect the sources of power to the cities, all we're going to do is drive up the constraint costs, the cost of balancing the power system. And we've seen that over the last 15 years. Those costs have gone up from less than £100 million a year to £2.7 billion in the latest figures that we got.
Yeah, and another point that Rachel Fletcher made to us was that she questioned whether these network costs should be paid for in advance.
The network costs are essentially added on to the regulated asset base, and then they are paid for by consumers over 45 years. So the current generation of consumers will pay a small fraction of the total investment.
Yeah.
I think the perhaps what she's alluding to is a proposal that I know some sort of people in the market, particularly suppliers, have come forward, which is the idea we securitise some of this and then almost charge it back in 10 years' time to customers. That's something that we're open to, but so far we found the impacts just on networks are quite marginal, so there would be a wider, more strategic intervention that would be needed.
Okay, so if that's not a viable option, how do we, as a committee, make recommendations on how to government on how to cut energy bills when it comes to non-commodity costs?
So I just say on that last option, it's something that we would be happy to continue to work with the industry on. It's just about the materiality of it and whether we think it's going to make significant impact to bills. Look, I think it's worth stepping back and thinking, what are we trying to do with this system that we're building and those non-commodity costs? In a sense, where the market has changed is if we are going to have the large-scale systemic change that we are planning, you need to make sure that your strategic planning is done in an effective way. And I've been around different forms of sort of the government and the regulator and the industry in the last 15 years. I do believe the creation of NESO is a big step forward in allowing us to better strategically plan our networks. And part of the reason we are running the networks program we have today is based on the engineering planning that NESO does. Second, as Fintan says, getting the operation of that market right and getting our market arrangements in place through reform national pricing is really important. So making sure that once you can locate your generation in the most efficient place, once you have the most efficient network to make that, to connect all that together, it's about how you operate that more efficiently. And then the third thing I say, Chair, is look, there are big policy choices government could make. Now, it's not for us to sort of give you an idea as to what our preference is, but the Chancellor is obviously...
Well, that is what I asked you to do, to be fair.
I will stray a bit out of Ofgem's remit, which is unusual for me, as you know. But the Chancellor made a big policy decision in the spring statement, and we have seen levies move on to taxation. Now, I don't have to protect the country's fiscal position, so I don't see all of the trade-offs, but it seems to me you are moving from a set of costs that are generally not very progressive or indeed regressive in the energy system to costs that are progressive elsewhere. Obviously, as the regulator that is concerned about reducing costs, we'd welcome interventions like that. And I think when you think about the Warm Homes Plan and the potential to reduce the impact on bills, that again is something that we would in principle support.
Thank you. And the £300 that Rachel Fletcher quoted about non-commodity costs adding to a typical bill, is that a good prediction between now and 2030? Or do you have an alternative figure?
So for network charges, we set out our estimate of how network charges would evolve because of the Rio transmission controls that we published last year. And we see essentially the network charges rising by about £110. And those will be offset by constrained cost savings and a reduction in the wholesale power prices, because renewables will be displacing expensive gas on the system. And that benefit, we reckon, is about £80. So when we set out our impact assessment of what is the impact of these price control decisions on bills, the net impact is about £30 or about £2.5 a month.
Increase. Okay, not 300. Right.
Well, I think she may be referring to networks plus, I assume, costs of things like contracts for difference. So maybe you've had those two together.
So is that overall figure something you recognise then?
I think we'd have to come back to you on CFD costs. Yeah.
It does depend on what exactly she was talking about, so we can certainly follow up.
I mean, we'd be very interested in what you think the figure is.
Wow. Yeah, we'll come back.
You can. And Fintan, do you have a view?
Only just without repeating what Jonathan and Akshay said, the one thing that we haven't mentioned is how much energy is used and when. So we've talked about policy costs and networks and things, but There's also opportunity in terms of reducing the impact of bills in individuals, whether that's houses or businesses, by continuing to roll out energy efficiency measures. So we talked about that in the advice that we gave to government when they were creating their CP30 plan, that could cut energy usage by 5 to 10% by 2030, which will have a direct impact on bills. Also, what we refer to as flexibility. So not running your tumble dryer between 5 and 7 o'clock at night. If you are on a tariff that rewards you for that, that can save your average consumer £200 to £300 a year off their bill.
Yeah, we've been very unimpressed by the suggestion that people have to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to turn their washing machine on. So you're lucky Polly Billington isn't here to challenge you on it. If you've watched previous sessions, you'll understand the reference. So what you've just given us is that if people cut their usage, that's the best way of cutting their bills.
Efficiency, so not making unacceptable choices about, so if I forego this, my bill will be cheaper. It's things like efficient light bulbs, so things that people are already installing in factories and homes, continuing that rollout, and
hasn't that already been done?
Not everywhere, no. So we think that there is further potential for that in the next 5 years.
Right. I think it's worth just adding to my colleague that we are seeing a growth in time-based tariffs. I know all the challenges around it, but particularly as you see the growth of electric vehicles, for example, that is a good partner with people who begin to transition, accepting not everybody's in that position.
Yes, and that lots of household appliances do have timers on them. I appreciate that
exactly.
too. Right. So the Climate Change Committee is projecting significant falls in bills by 2050. Are they sufficiently taking into account non-commodity costs and their potential to rise? And in reality, are we going to be stuck with high bills for the foreseeable future?
So I'll defer to Fintan to talk about the 2030 analysis and what that says about costs, but ultimately we see costs to the 2030 of the system being roughly stable, and then you do begin to see costs falling after that. But I have to say, all of that is based upon technology assumptions, and we have to accept that all of these things have quite big error bars around them. Fintan.
Yeah, so in the analysis we did to 2030, as Jonathan said, we looked at the transition to clean power, as we set out in the advice, and we compared that against a counterfactual, and broadly the system costs taken as a whole were broadly the same. We have also, as part of the analysis that we do, one of the key pieces we do is the future energy scenarios work, which looks out even further out to 2050 and looks at how energy bills might evolve over that period. Claire led that work. Do you want to say a little bit around what that said around sort of bills as a percentage of energy costs?
Yeah, so what, as Fintan said, what the future energy scenarios do is look at different pathways to meet the legislative targets, and across those pathways we identified that total energy costs, so that is non-commodity as well as commodity, would move from about 10% of GDP, which is where it is today, to approximately 5 to 6% of GDP by 2050. So our analysis is different to the Climate Change Committee's, but it is commensurate in terms of the outcomes that it comes out with.
Okay, so you are confident that bills will come down?
I mean, what ends up in bills is always a function of policy choices, but for the system costs, and that includes everything from replacing boilers through to the commodity costs, does become a smaller proportion of GDP by 2050. What is also, I think, important just in the context of the last few days is the impact that it has on volatility as well, and the significant increase that we saw in 2022, where we saw the proportion of GDP, the energy costs of that went up by about 1.8%. If we were in 2050 and had the same impact, the increased spend would only be about 0.3%, because we'd be so much less exposed to the impact of the gas prices Jonathan was saying earlier.
Thank you very much. Now, Mike Reid has got some questions on Rio and Tenuos.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. If I can just continue with NESO. We've heard a suggestion that as it's a function of the trading in the system, constraint costs are an externality and therefore should not be paid by consumers on their bills. Is that achievable?
Well, so constraint costs, as Akshay was saying, are, I'm sure everyone in this committee is well read, but they're a function of the system design, both the physical and the market design, where the largest proportion of them are due to generators that are connected in the north of the country, not being able to generate because the infrastructure isn't there yet to transport that energy down to the centres of demand. The system is designed in that way, so there is an efficient level of constraint costs, otherwise you would end up by building a system to cover every eventuality. The network plans that the network companies are delivering under their Rio price controls put that network in place. Where those costs are born is a decision for government, but it wouldn't stop those costs being incurred. The important thing is to deliver the network that, as Akshay was saying, offsets those costs.
Why should consumers pay it? It's a function of the businesses. Shouldn't it be absorbed into the business operations rather than passed on to consumers?
It's the fundamental design of the market arrangements in the UK, as we were saying, that the market arrangements here have largely been are largely the same as they were at the point of privatisation. There's been some changes. That is the way the market is designed, and the market programmes that Fintan was talking about earlier that the government is running do look at those types of questions and ask the more fundamental design questions about where costs are incurred and what policy decisions.
In that work, you are looking at that as an option. What's the initial thinking first, from the work you've done so far, Fintan?
I think the focus at the moment, so we've just published the call for input, right? So let's be clear, we're at the very early stages of looking for input on all of this. But the focus at the moment is how to minimise the overall costs. At the end of the day, because of the way the system is, consumers end up picking up the bill, even if you were to charge those constraint costs to generators, that would just up the amount that they bid into the system, and ultimately consumers would pay. So we have a mechanism at the moment where they're recovered through what's called balancing and use of system charges. We will look at other ways that they could potentially be recovered, but the focus at the moment, being transparent about it, is around how do we get a market design and a system that delivers the most efficient outcomes. You then have a cost allocation question after that.
And if I come to Ofgem on Rio, and my knowledge on this particular matter might be slightly outdated, so I worked on a big pitch for Rio 2. I was quite shocked at how inefficient Rio was. It seemed a bit of a cartel for the contractors. The same contractors then appointed. Is that the same for Rio 3, or have you found the efficiency gains? Is it running more effectively now, or are we still seeing the same contractors who are massively underperforming, massively late on their delivery, still making excess profits in delivery?
I think we recently published a State of the Market report covering the performance of the networks across a range of different criteria, including on cost, reliability, carbon, and quality of service. And by and large, the performance of the industry in Rio, both 2 as well as recently on 3, has been very good. So reliability is extremely strong. Their performance in terms of storm resilience has improved ever since Storm Arvin. We've been relentlessly working with them to improve how quickly they get people connected back onto power. Their customer service scores have been improving. And overall, in terms of network charges, Britain is sort of middle of the range when we benchmark ourselves across other countries. So overall, the Rio is, the incentives in Rio seem to be working pretty well. What's coming up now, the 2 iconic problems in network regulation, one is connections, and the other one is the build of the network to bring all these constraint costs down. And I think that is the iconic challenge for these network companies, and we're going to be hot on their case to get them to build the network to time and budget and connect people as quickly as possible.
I think it's worth, sorry to jump in, but I think it's worth just describing a bit about how we see the system evolving, because I think underneath the question there is a genuine question we have about whether the network regulation we have in place today is going to be clear enough about the progress the companies are making on a whole number of fronts. So, you know, we read the Cunliffe report with interest, for example, and we are thinking about how we reshape network regulation to look more intensively, not only at how they're running and managing their assets, but as Akshay says, as we enter this build program for transmission, and doubtless there'll be similar programs in distribution, making sure that we are holding the companies to account in a much more granular way. And I think that is something that Ofgem is developing, but I think all infrastructure regulators will be doing something similar.
Thank you. And I guess I'll pick up a bit on what the Chair was talking about. What options are there beyond the Rio price control mechanism to avoid network costs making up an ever-increasing share of bills, and who should be responsible for implementing them?
So I think, you know, in a sense, we've got a set of trade-offs that you ultimately need to make. And Claire mentioned before about time use of energy. In a sense, greater flexibility, so greater use of batteries, greater flexibility in our demand where we can, all of which will offset the need for generation and networks. So the programme that Fintan's described, you know, this sense of how we deliver the strategic plan that NESO are working on, and then how we operate the system efficiently, will absolutely define the level of network costs that we see in the system. And the second part, once we have all that in place, it really is down to the regulators, down to us, to make sure that the amounts that we allow in the bill reflect efficient delivery, coming back to your point, and that customers get what they need out of it. So now we've settled Rio, our preoccupation is genuinely making sure customers get what was promised out of the programme, and that comes back to the questions that were asked previously about 2030 delivery. So we spend most of our time talking to networks now about, are you delivering the change in infrastructure that we think we've asked customers to pay for?
Thank you. And final question, could network costs be smoothed out over a longer period?
I think we talked a bit about this. You know, the regulated asset base already automatically spreads them out over 45 years. But I think a number of stakeholders have said to us that, you know, to the extent that we are investing as a country ahead of need, and this will come up, I think, most visibly in the distribution sector. So to the extent we are saying to the networks, expand your networks in anticipation of the heat and the transport demand that is to come in the future, there is a good case for spreading that out further into the future and not charging it all to current consumers. And that's where we're looking at more innovative mechanisms like securitization, etc., to see if we can have that effect. But it's too early to say what difference. First of all, it's too early to say how much this anticipatory investment ahead of need is going to be in the distribution grid. And secondly, how much difference this kind of thing will make to the amounts that people pay per year on their energy bill is a bit too early to say.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about the distribution use of system costs. So if I could ask Jonathan, obviously we've had some delay and chopping and changing when it comes to the significant code review, but could you say how much you think we might see distribution network investment costs go up in the future? And do you think they're going to end up being the biggest part of network costs?
Actually.
Yeah, again, I think we're just in the process of doing the price review for distribution, which will start from 2028 and run until 2033. So next year we'll have a much better feel for what the investment program of the distribution companies looks like, and therefore what the scale of that investment is likely to be. I think my current assessment is that it is unlikely to be of the same scale of increase that we're seeing in the transmission sector. And that's only because in the transmission sector we're actually trying to catch up quickly with a huge increase in renewable generation that is already on the system or shortly coming on the system. Whereas with the distribution grids we have a little bit more time to make sure that we get ahead of the demand.
So when the National Infrastructure Commission estimated a total of 37 to 50 billion pounds required in the distribution network investment up to 2050, although there's potential to reduce that through maximising consumer flexibility, are you saying that is, you don't see that being making a significant difference on the bills that eventually come through to consumers?
Yeah, I think in terms of the effect on bills, because the regulated asset base smooths all this out over 45 years, it takes a lot to move the bill impact of network charges materially. So if we have, for instance, the rate of expenditure in the distribution grid going up by 10 or 20%, which would not be an implausible guesstimate, that would have a very small effect of about £1 or a couple of pounds per year on the household bill.
So to be clear, I think that there may still be increase in distribution costs, but if you compare that number actually to what we're spending on transmission in a shorter period of time, that's a lot more.
Okay, so my next question then may not be so relevant, because I was going to say, how might ED3, the next price control, keep these costs reasonable? Your argument is that in the grand scheme of things, even if they change quite significantly, overall the actual change consumers will see will be very small.
No, in fact, we actually have been quite persuaded by the National Infrastructure Commission's report, which argued in favour of getting ahead of demand and investing once in the distribution grid for a long period of time to take us to 2050. But we want to make sure that we balance that, as Jonathan was saying, with the full use of flexibility of demand. Because I think on the distribution grid that can make a tremendous difference to how much you need to reinforce the distribution grid and when you need to reinforce the distribution grid.
Look, I think distribution is different to transmission in the sense that you've got higher voltage network and lower voltage network. The higher voltage network in distribution is a little bit more like transmission. You have to kind of build that strategically. You can't sort of adapt as you go. As you get to the wires that connect our homes and through the streets, that's much more adaptable. So the trick with this price control, in my mind, will be making sure that as our projections sort of versus reality become clear, we can adapt more what we need to spend, and we don't necessarily have to be locked in quite so early. Whereas transmission, at some point, you have to make a judgment, because these are 12 to 14-year projects, and even the build is 4 or 5 years long.
Are 5-year periods of price control long enough to incentivise suppliers and consumers to take up flexibility? Or
yeah, for flexibility, I think the incentives that we're putting in are going to be strong and will be sufficient. I think the thing we're trying to do alongside the incentives for flexibility is put in place a longer-term spatial planning framework for both the national system as well as the distribution system, the transmission system and the distribution system, so that we can plan properly for the uptake of heat pumps and electric vehicles and solar panels in each of the areas across the country, and then use flexibility to optimize the timing and the scale of the network reinforcement that is needed.
At the distribution level, that's more flexible.
It is.
Doesn't need the same level of deployment. Then does that long-term plan make much difference in that context? I can see why it's very important for the distribution network, the larger end, the higher voltage ends of the distribution network, but ultimately you can make decisions on a much more short-term basis when you see what's actually happening with the flexibility.
Well,
that's what you're saying.
That to me is the trick in the design of the price control, is to make sure your strategic investment is matching regional plans, and that then you are as far as you can be, you are allowing the companies to be adaptable to where demand occurs and the rate at which it occurs. So, inevitably, the projections we have on things like electric vehicles and heat pumps, there will always be a deviation year on year, and it's making sure we don't overbuild or underbuild against the changes that we see in the market. So, that's why I think you've got to get your design of the price control right, and indeed through the regional energy system planning, which is beginning to get going, making sure that those things are aligned and we understand strategic needs in different areas. One last thing I would just say on length of price controls, we did have 8 years on Rio. The downside of a very long price control is, again, if it gets out of sync with reality in ways you can't predict, then that can become quite big after 8 years.
You're coming in a minute anyway. Graham's questions next. You can come up.
No, I was just making sure you'd seen Melanie on that.
Well,
yes, I'm next.
You have some
Anyone
questions
else?
on, which follow on from Claire's.
Thank you, Lynn. Chair, I want to just ask a couple of questions around balancing costs that you touched on earlier. But Jonathan, if I can just go very briefly back to your initial statement around increasing intensity of market research. Just while we've been meeting, there's a report that energy firms are pulling all of their fixed deals off of the shelves in response to what they see as a forthcoming rise in price caps. When you're meeting with them, will you urge them to stop doing that?
Well, I think we've got to accept, going back to the conversation we had, if you're under the price cap, you're under the system that I've described, but energy companies are going to find it hard to hedge forward, which we want them to do in all of their purchasing in the same terms they could a week ago. So look, we are going to work very hard to make sure that we protect customers. We're going to make sure that we are cognizant of customers in vulnerable circumstances, but I can understand that those offers are becoming uneconomic.
Thank you. I didn't mean to put you on the spot. There's nothing worse than that. I just since it came out and referred to it earlier on. Just on balancing costs, the overwhelming majority of that, about 1.7 billion in 24-25 of that came from thermal constraint costs and physical infrastructure. Can you outline why that's happened, and if the increase in infrastructure that we're hopefully seeing being built, will that reduce the balancing costs going forward, and if so, by how much and how quickly? That's probably Claire or Fintan, I think, possibly.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right that the majority of the balancing costs incurred at the moment are due to thermal constraint costs, and the main driver of that is trying to move generation from the north of the country, typically offshore wind, Scotland and down the east coast, to the centres of demand in the southeast of the country. And the network builds that John has talked about, that the network companies are the programme that they're engaged in to deliver out to 2030 and beyond, is the network that's needed in order to mitigate those constraints and bring them down. We continually look at, and when we're doing the plans, we continually look at levels of constraint and network build, and there is a trade-off between those two things. What we see when we look out to 2030 is that constraint costs are likely to rise up until 2030.
And so will that be thermal restraint costs that are likely to rise, and then is the idea that by 2030 that infrastructure will be better and that will fall? So is will the thermal constraint costs remain the biggest opportunity to reduce overall balancing costs?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So that's where the savings should happen.
That's where the savings should happen, and you see as the network projects commission, and you know, unfortunately, you need them. They're not there one day; they are the next day, right? And you get all of the benefit on the next day. So constraint costs rise, and then the transmission owners program has programs delivering, those big transmission programs delivering in 28, 29, 30, and those constraint costs then fall, and that is the thermal constraint.
Like I say, right now it's 1.7 billion out of 2.7 billion. Would you have any hope or target or thought even in your head about where that might end up by, say, 2030? Percentage-wise is perhaps a fairer way to put it.
Yeah, no, I mean we do have a graph of what that looks like out to 2030. So we see it go up to about £8 billion in 2030, and then come back to around, I think it's £2 billion post that, and it goes up and down then after that around that, Joe. Why
would it go up and down if we're saying we've got the infrastructure built, so we should have less constraints? Why is it not kind of a peak and a tail off?
Beautiful.
That's why.
Because even after 2030, you continue to build generation facilities, and you continue then to need to build networks. So it's
more about like one should naturally continuously cycle to catch up with the other.
Yes. And what we're seeing at the moment is that lead times for transmission infrastructure are considerably longer than the lead times for the generation infrastructure.
Will we ever see that balancing cost at a much lower level consistent, or will it exist to cycle the whole time?
You won't see it come down. You won't see the thermal constraint number come down to zero.
So it will roughly make up the same proportion or the same number for the foreseeable future.
Yes. So I think it has risen this year over last year. It will fall back post 2030. Right. I think a bit. but you're never going to get the thermal constraint number down to zero, because that would mean that you have built a network and invested in a network that never has for any 5 minutes of any year any constraint on it. So there is a balance.
Clues in the name.
What?
Clues in the name.
Yeah. Yeah.
What is an acceptable balancing cost, or what is a level you think you should be able to get to if everything is working perfectly well, or as well as it can?
So I think looking out sort of post 2030, when you have pullback network delivery times, and there's a huge program of work underway to do that, we see balancing costs, I think, in the range of around £2 billion per annum in that period. Now, remember, in balancing costs, there's a thermal constraint is the biggest element at the moment, but there is also a chunk of other costs in there around services that we need to purchase in order to safely and securely balance the system, like buying inertia, buying reserve from the system. So we will always need to do those things as well, to purchase sort of services from the market, be that from batteries or generators or networks, in order to balance the system.
And just very briefly, as someone who spent quite a large part of their life trying to get renewable projects consented in Scotland, one of the biggest barriers we had with the public was complaints around constraint costs and wind farms being paid to be turned off. It was a recurring theme everywhere we went, which was frustrating, as you can imagine. But are there things that NESO can do to provide additional flexibility to bring that down and that complaint level down? If you're talking about moving generation closer, you're going to have the problem we had, frankly, in Scotland replicated in other parts where that complaint will come up again. Are there things you can do to stop that, frankly, if we're trying to build generation faster?
I think there's two major things. One is better long-term strategic planning, such that you actually build the network such that it is there at the same time as the generation wants to connect. So at the moment it has been reactionary, so the generation would have a contract and then you'd initiate the programme to connect it, but the lead times got completely disconnected. With strategic spatial energy planning and then moving into the other, there's acronyms for all of them, I can assure you, but what's called the Central Strategic Network Plan, which is the actual network delivery, that allows, that is designed to allow the network be built at a time to meet the generation when it's due to connect, wherever it's due to connect, such that you actually get a more long-term strategic line-up plan, and therefore that, in the long term, will reduce constraints because you won't have this mismatch between them. The other piece in the short term is stuff that we can do operationally just to manage the system in a more economic way, to eke like every last megawatt out of all of the transmission lines. And that is things like new technology in our control room to allow us to issue more instructions and be more nimble in how we balance the system, but also working with the transmission owners to deploy new technology on the lines. So there's a major program underway. It started before Rio 3, but got significantly scaled up in Rio 3 around dynamic line rating. This is where you install advanced technology on the transmission lines that allow you to push more power through them when the conditions are right. And actually, it's very fortunate. Our problem tends to be our transmission lines are constrained when it's windy in Scotland, and the wind allows you to cool the lines and push more power down through them. So there is the potential to deploy that technology in a way that does actually...
Who knew the Scottish weather would be helpful?
There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah. Why would it ever be acceptable, or would it ever be acceptable to see constraint costs going to 2 billion or higher?
Sorry, Chair, just...
Constraint costs, because Akshay, you were saying there were 100 million. They're going to go to 2 billion? Did I get that right?
Currently at about 2.7 billion.
Yeah. So why is that acceptable?
So actually the balancing costs are 2.7 billion.
Yeah.
I think the constraint cost is 1.7 out of those.
Yeah.
So I think there are two parts to the question. The first is that when you move from a fossil fuel system to a renewable system, there will be a natural increase in the level of efficient constraint costs. I'll explain what I mean in a second. But that is because you have much more variability in the supply sources. So there's a reason to believe that the efficient level of constraints goes up. The efficient level of constraint is the level at which it is cheaper to tolerate the constraint than to build new network. And this is the point that Fintan was making. That's why we never want to drive them down to zero. We want to continue to expand the network until that point that the marginal network build is more expensive than just managing or tolerating the constraints, or just paying the wind farms to switch off. And so that level, we will find out what that level is, but that level in a renewable system will almost certainly be higher than the average that we had during the fossil fuel years.
I think it's worth saying, though, we accept, I think, collectively that constraint costs are too high, which is why we're building the network at the pace we are. And so when it came back to the debates on Rio, that it is that funding that we need to get the system systemically to a different place.
I was just going to say that, as you've acknowledged, it's important not to forget that constraint costs are the largest part of balancing costs by far. But even if constraint costs were zero, which they never would be, there will still be a balancing cost, because the fundamental role of the system operator is to balance the system and ensure, from a physics point of view, it continues to work, and that costs money, so that cost will always be there. And it's why it's so important, all the things that Fintan said, that we're concentrating on in terms of how we run the system and ensuring that we use the best technology and things. We've actually taken just over £1.2 billion worth out of balancing costs in the last few years with that type of activity, so we shouldn't lose focus on that either.
No, as we've overrun, I'm not going to let people come in too much now, but you have some questions later, so ask it then. But Mike's got you've got the next set.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Can we talk about distribution use of system and those costs? And I think these questions are primarily for Ofgem colleagues, so NESO, you're off the hook for now. By how much might we see distribution network investment costs go up in future? Will these be the biggest part of future network costs?
It's too early to say. I think we will know more next year when we see the spending plans of the distribution network companies, and we'll be able to give you a much more precise estimate then.
But in terms of the spread now, I mean, distribution costs are higher on the bill now.
They are. Yeah. I mean, they are a bigger part of the bill already than transmission, but transmission is rising very sharply. It's gone up from £50 to about £83 per year. Distribution at the moment is much more than that.
I thought you had questions on the transmission network.
Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong page. Apologies. Apologies. NESO, you're back on the hook. So I'm watching the clock, because I've got to run in 2 minutes, so you may get away. NESO, we're talking about transition costs. Yes, you're right, Chair. So deepest apologies. How confident are you of your predictions in your 5-year view of transmission costs, and what variables could you see go higher or lower? The transmission network use of system charges that we publish, NESO acts as an administrator in that scheme. So we strategically plan the system and identify the network that is needed, and then each of the network companies, through the Rio controls that we've already talked about, work with Ofgem to determine exactly what they're going to build and how much that is going to cost, and we then recover that on their behalf through those charges. So we're given that information through the networks. It's set by the price controls, so there's little variability around it, but that doesn't negate anything that we've already talked about around there's opportunities on top of that in terms of innovation and things, which means there's always opportunity to use that network that's there in different ways as new technology is developed. And the current system we have, was it designed with the current, under the assumption of what the government currently is in terms of the large-scale investment in transmission? Is the current system fit for purpose, given we're seeing so much more money going into the transmission network under the Clean Power 2030 programme?
I think it's fair to say that everything in the energy system was designed for how the world looked at the time of privatisation at the end of the 80s. So the market frameworks, the network. And we're moving into a different world where policy objectives are necessarily different. So we've talked a lot about market frameworks and how they need to be reformed to be fit for purpose. Investment is needed in the network as well. It is worth saying that even if we were not shifting to a more renewable generation mix, there would still need to be significant investment in the network because the gas CCGT fleet is coming to the end of life, as we've discussed extensively, and it's very front of mind in terms of the last few days. Where our gas is coming from is changing. So whatever supply mix we are in the energy system, we would be at a point of investment now anyway.
Do you think the current system delivers best value for the consumer?
So everyone that operates in the energy system who is licensed is obliged to operate in an economic and efficient manner. There are lots of things that we've covered off today, like strategic plans and market reforms, which all have the objective of ultimately lowering bills at the end of the day.
Is being economically efficient different to being best value for the consumer?
No, I think they're the same.
You'd say the current system gives the consumer best value?
We all have the objective of operating to the most efficient way we can, but all of those programmes that we've mentioned all have a primary objective of lowering bills,
is
which
that
is best
objective
value.
being met, I think is the question.
We're in a state of transition at the minute and implementing those things, and it's some of the shorter term tactical things that we're layering in with that as well to make sure that we're delivering the best value we can at this point in time as well.
Are there any recommendations that you've made to DESNZ to reduce transmission costs and transmission costs and cost to consumer that they haven't yet adopted?
It's not our role to recommend as such. We provide advice into the government, but the advice that we provide them is from a system operator perspective. They will be getting input from lots of other parties as well, and then government taking decisions based on all of those things together. We work really closely with government and with Ofgem. And across the three organisations, we can take those whole system views, and government ultimately can make balanced decisions.
Are there any, Fintan, is there any pieces of advice you've given to DESNZ that they've not yet adopted that could reduce the cost, if you do give advice?
In terms of the sort of, so when NESO was set up, there is sort of this function where government can request formal advice around it. I don't believe there's any of those sort of pieces of formal advice where they haven't taken on the recommendations that we've had. I mean, we engage with them across a broad range of stuff. I think the sort of formal advice is a subset of that. But no, I think we absolutely feel heard, and
Akshay, Jonathan, same to you. Anything that you kind of said to DESNZ, we should do this to reduce transmission costs, and they've not yet. Perhaps it's politically, unattractive to them, but it technically is correct. Is there anything that you've proposed that would reduce those transmission costs they haven't yet adopted?
So I think we are working through reform national pricing, and the whole idea of that will be to join charging with the balancing and system costs that Fintan outlined and strategic planning. That is all coming. There's nothing in there that I think we've formally recommended that they've said no to. That's just a piece of work that's in train. We've already expressed enthusiasm for the Chancellor's intervention in the spring statement, and beyond that, there's probably a matter for ministers.
So do you think reform national pricing will put a downward pressure on the transmission network use of system and costs?
By design, that combined with strategic planning are intended to do that, and balancing costs as well.
Final question. We've heard that the previous transmission network use of system charges had levied a lot of money on generators in the past towards building a network which was never built. Is that true?
Not really. So the generators pay about £1 billion out of the £8 billion of transmission charges, and all of that money has gone into investment in the networks over the last 10 years. The reality is that network investment itself has not been sufficient. So I think the biggest lesson from the last 10 years is that we needed to have a strategic plan which coordinated generation and network much earlier, and then upgraded the network much sooner. So the increases that we're seeing coming through now in transmission charges, of which the generators will pay about an eighth, most of it will be paid by households and businesses. That is paying for this big uptick in investment.
Thank you. Mel.
Thank you. I want to talk about some connections reform and constraint costs in a bit more detail and ask if grid connections are not facilitated in a timely manner, what impact will there be on consumer bills? Can you put figures on it over the next few years?
So is it worth talking about the connections programme first of all, and then perhaps we'll come back to the impact on customers and what it might mean?
Yeah, so connections reform programming is a huge and complex once-in-a-generation change in how we think about who and how projects connect to the system. So we found ourselves with a generation connection queue designed on a first-come, first-served basis with about 850 gigawatts in it. And just to give you a sense of scale, peak demand is about 50-ish gigawatts, so massively oversubscribed queue. So through a period of industry reform, and it is a detailed open code governance process in the industry to develop mechanisms to change that over a number of years.
This is very interesting, Fintan, but I mean, if they are not done in a timely manner, and I don't know what your definition of a timely manner actually is, and I'd be very happy for you to give me a series of dates, then what does that really mean for consumer costs?
So I don't think you can draw a one-for-one line with consumer costs, because the impact on consumer costs depends on how that generation project decides to bid its project in and participate in the market. But undoubtedly, we have identified now the projects that should connect, so the ones that are strategically aligned to government policy and the ones that are ready to go. And we sort of curated that connections queue at the start of December and told all of the projects in it where they stood with respect to that. And therefore the focus now is to get connection offers, like the formal connection offer, out to each of those projects. Okay. So each project now knows, am I going to get a connection offer to connect, or am I what's called gate one, which is actually you're not strategically aligned or you're not ready to go. And if you are going to get a connection project offer, you now know the window in which we will provide you with that connection offer. So the teams across us and all of the network companies are now doing the detailed engineering and design based on this new different queue to work out technically what needs to be built to connect this project and when it can connect, and then that gets packaged up into a legal connection offer. So that process is underway. There's a timeline that is now published and established, and all of the generators know it, so they will know when they can get a connection offer. And we've started to issue those connection offers out the door.
Okay. And Jonathan,
well,
I mean, do you feel confident and comfortable in that? Do you feel like you can go to consumers and say, it's all right, plan's working, and we think now we've got a plan, we've got rid of all of those projects that were just hanging around, we're doing it on a first delivery, ready to go project basis, this is going to make a material difference to you?
I think it will make a material difference. It's fundamental to delivering 2030, which, as we described right at the start of this, is really the way in which we avoid the volatility that we've described today. So strategically, it's incredibly important. Yes, we are confident in delivery. It has been a difficult process, so we have had to adjust our timetables, but we understood that when we went into this. The key thing for all of us is to make sure the coordination between NESO and the transmission companies and the distribution companies in particular now is done in a way that gets these offers out, gives developers certainty, and allows us to make sure that this is keeping 2030 on track. Now, we're confident we've got that, but these are complex, unique contracts that we are changing. So it is a process that we are working very hard with the companies to deliver.
I mean, I think from an outside perspective, it does feel like it's taking a long time for us to see meaningful impacts on those connections, and reforms to the queue were sort of suggested 3 years ago, 4 years ago. Why does it take so long?
I think it's understandable that there's a frustration out there about how long it's taken, but I suppose this is a massive change to the industry and to the contracts that all of those 850 gigawatts of projects held. So they all held individual contracts, and they've all now in the process of being changed. And the process to do that is set out in industry codes that have very strictly defined governance processes that you need to walk through. And part of the reason it took time was making sure that it was done comprehensively and properly, such that it didn't become subject to judicial review, for example, of being, not a properly done reform. So, that undoubtedly took a significant amount of time to walk through all of that industry change process, get to a sort of formal proposal from the industry code panel that ultimately went to Ofgem, who then ran a consultation and approved a methodology. But at that point now we just have a methodology, an agreement about how we're going to reform the codes. We then, and that was the spring last year, and then through last year was the start of the implementation of that. So we had to, this introduced new requirements. So for example, this ready to go criteria, so were you a project ready, we had to get from each of those projects their land rights. So what form of land rights do you have over where you're going to site this? Do you have a lease?
None of this is a surprise though, is it? I really don't understand why it takes so long and processes kind of established for a sense of processes' sake.
I think it's really important that to acknowledge what we were trying to balance with Ofgem and government as well, which was speed is of the essence. As you're saying, it was a huge problem to have shovel-ready projects being held up by not real projects in front of them. But balancing that with maintaining the message that we're open for business here. As Fintan was saying, this is one of the most significant contracts that those projects hold and if we were just to overnight rip them up and change the rules, it would have had a huge impact on investor certainty. So following due process and making sure everyone had
did that manage to hang on then to all those other projects that were chucked off the list? If you were worried about investor certainty, did they all hang around? Are they all still here? Are they all still planning to invest?
So I think it's worth looking at the different technologies. So offshore wind, we saw lots of bids in AR7. So yes, they are there. Yes, we are getting them connected. You then get to smaller scale onshore wind and solar, and we think we have roughly what we expect for 2030. And then the battery market, we have a huge number of people who are trying to build batteries, which we absolutely need as part of our system. So I think that we're not. We need to be honest that this has taken longer than we hoped, but we are going through a set of quite fundamental changes, and we are meeting regularly together, and we are working very hard together to make sure that when we get those offers out, those offers are consistent with our ambition to change the system, those offers are fair, and also that we're legally robust, and that does take time.
Can I just ask about data centres, a couple of questions on those. Is there going to be a big impact on consumer network costs if we get lots of data centres, as government is interested in doing, being connected? And are there any considerations about any kind of private wire agreements around offshore wind to try and bring down curtailment costs and therefore bills if there is heavy demand assets like data centres that are brought onto the system?
I think a lot depends upon the specifics of these data centers, where they're located and how they connect to the grid and how they source their generation. I think if you look around the world, we have examples of countries. Ireland is one of them. There are states in the US where if you have a unplanned, uncontrolled increase in the demand from data centers, it pushes up the electricity prices for everybody. But we think that if you have a more managed system and we have a way of ensuring that data centers are in a sense contributing to the generation as well as taking up the network capacity and providing a bit of flexibility into the power system, then there is a way of connecting what I think the country needs without it having a significantly negative effect on consumers. But I think, Fintan, you and the team have been doing a lot of thinking in this area.
Yeah, no, I mean, I completely agree with what you said, actually. I think the thing to point out as well, though, is there is a huge number of speculative projects out there, sort of in the demand side queue for connection to the system. I think data centres are close to 100 gigawatts in that space. That is orders of magnitude more than the government has indicated they might want to get and could possibly connect in the system. So I think all of the planning that we have done, things like FES and the Clean Power Trend, assumed some level of data centres within that. And I think, as Akshay said, if you think about data centres and think about locating them in the right place on the system, they can actually be helpful. If you put them in the wrong place, they can cause problems, be that sort of costs or constraint costs. And the second thing is making sure that they have a level of flexibility associated with them when they commission. And we've seen, in particular, there's some great examples in the US where they've introduced rules and regulations requiring levels of flexibility that make a really meaningful difference to their impact on the system. So I think overall what I would say is, in terms of the AI growth ambition and the associated build out of data centres, it looks to us like there's a way to manage that, but you actually have to actively manage it. And we see things like AI growth zones as a really good initiative that is helpful in that regard.
Thank you. We've been increasingly talking about battery storage through the session, and one of the pieces of feedback we've had about the the connections reform process is that those developers at Gate 2 who had battery as part of their proposal have had to remove the battery element. Now, we heard you saying you've got plenty of battery on the system, but what consideration has been given to the impact on the economic viability of projects where they've had to remove their batteries, and indeed the technical constraints of doing so between you?
I don't know specifics, Chair, of the project, but maybe to talk a little bit, because I think I know the nub of the issues. So the first thing to say is there are significantly more batteries going to get connection offers as part of Gate 2 than was indicated in government's sort of 2030 Clean Power Action Plan. And that's because an awful lot of them had progressed and got planning consent and land access rights at the
So as far as you're concerned, we'll have more battery capacity than we need?
It does look that way, yes. I think we certainly will. There is, for where projects, where you have hybrid projects, so those are projects that have sort of two technologies associated with them. What we've seen is that some of those projects were originally just one technology, and then a number of years later they added the second technology. So maybe they were originally a solar park and they applied just as a solar park, and then a few years later, while they're still in the connection queue, they said, actually, we now want to make this a hybrid project. We want to add a battery to that site, so the site will now have a solar park and a battery. The way that gets treated as part of the connections reform process is, because they were applied for at two different times, they get treated as two different projects within it. And what we've seen, therefore, is that some developers who were therefore progressing a hybrid project because they'd added the battery now find that they'll get a connection offer that connects the two bits sequentially rather than at the same time. And that's the way the methodology works, and was an attempt around fairness, because otherwise the battery that was added later will skip over all of those other batteries in the queue. So that is a feature of the reform, the way it is working.
You've explained that, yeah. Right, we'd better move on to Lizzie.
Thank you, Chair. So I want to talk about standing charge reform, and specifically low standing charge tariffs, which I understand to mean you pay a low or zero daily charge, but your kilowatt hour price is higher, so each unit of energy costs more. When will suppliers be offering low standing charge tariffs?
So what we've announced is that there will be a large-scale pilot from 4 suppliers from April, where they will be offering at least £150 off the existing standing charge.
Okay, thank you. And obviously, a different tariff needs to be an informed choice by consumers. There's risks and benefits. So what will you do to ensure that consumers are fully informed and can make a good decision on what tariff to choose?
Well, part of the reason we're doing this as a kind of a big pilot, but as a pilot, is because we want to work very closely with the suppliers on how they communicate, so how they make it clear to customers what's in their interest, but also, you know, a big question is, if a customer discovers they're on the wrong tariff, what are the options open to them? How do they know that? And what should the role of the supplier be? So we're testing all of that as part of this large-scale pilot.
And will you be modelling at what point tariffs flip over into being better or worse for a consumer? So levels of energy consumption at which it makes sense to have a low standing charge tariff, and levels above which it really doesn't make sense. Will there be any modelling and illustration for customers?
Well, I think that's what we would expect the suppliers to do when they're describing the tariffs to customers, and we have, you know, rules already around supplier transparency. But I think there is a big question. The reason we are treading lightly with this is because there is a big question about how customers will understand this, how they will respond, and what they will do if they are able to discover they're on the wrong tariff. So we've been quite surprised by, as we've progressed some of these options, the concern that consumer groups have raised with us. So we want to do this with suppliers and with consumer groups before we would expand that out across the market.
Great, thanks. And finally, we previously made recommendations on exemptions to the gas standing charge and on a special summer regime for those on prepayment meters. Will you be implementing them?
You want to talk about gas standing charge?
So we are doing a review at the moment on the standing charges that relate to people who are reducing their use of gas because they're electrifying their home. I think I can be totally clear that if you disconnect from the gas network, then you don't have to pay standing charges. That is very clear. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people essentially don't disconnect because when they ask for a quote, first of all, the process seems very complicated. If you want to navigate, you know, who you should ask for a quote from, what timescales they serve you, etc., and then the quotes you get sometimes can be £2,500, £3,000 is what we're hearing. So we want to investigate that and say, is that a reasonable quote for somebody who needs to disconnect? And secondly, there is a strangeness in the rules that if you stay on the gas network but don't draw any gas for a period of time, then under the health and safety rules, the gas company has to come and essentially seal off the gas network coming into your home. And that cost of essentially disconnection is then socialized to all other consumers. The disconnecting customer doesn't pay that. And again, we wanted to ask whether is that a sensible set of rules? You know, should the people who are disconnecting pay for the costs of disconnection, or should they be socialized across everybody else? So we've been doing a call for input on that. We'll be coming out with some policy proposals in the next couple of months.
So just on the first part of that, and this is slightly separate to the safety issue, but on the first part of that, is there not a way of doing virtual disconnection? Why do they actually have to be physically disconnected from the gas system if you can see that they're not using any gas?
It's a safety issue in the main.
Okay, and what is that safety issue?
The issue
because there's gas coming into a house and being used or not being used all the time anyway.
Yes.
So what's different about it never being used?
I think the worry is that it could leak out if there is absolutely no check on it. So I think the health and safety rules just require you, if there's a long period of disuse, that the gas network has to go in and then seal it off.
So because there will be no monitoring of gas using appliances,
Correct.
It might deteriorate to the point. Okay,
Correct.
thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Graham.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on some issues around about modernisation of NESO systems, but also particularly around cyber security as well. IBM has found that energy is one of the most highly targeted sectors in the UK for cyber attack. We had the European Union Institute of Security Studies note that some Chinese hackers have shown they're preparing for attacks on critical infrastructure. Indeed, some of the discussion over the last couple of days has been how susceptible is the UK energy network to cyber and other types of attack in response from Iran. Can I ask you as specific as you possibly can be on this? I know it's difficult, but as specific as you're able to be around how secure you feel the UK energy system is, and in particular what conversations you've had with DESNES about improving that as well.
With us, I mean, so we are joint cyber competent authority with the department. Now, frankly, the industry, like every industry at the moment, is on a journey to continue to improve cybersecurity. We have a very detailed framework. Now, we don't share details for I hope you understand, for the reasons I hope you understand. And a bit like some of the other issues here, we can never guarantee there won't be a cyber incident, but we have made significant progress over the last few years in increasing that. And actually, I don't know if you want to add that.
Keen to understand, so how often do you run tests of that? Is that externally monitored? Is that who, as much, and I do understand the difficulty of giving away how you detect, but as much detail as you can that will provide reassurance?
Yes, mandatory testing is coming in from this summer onwards, and even before that mandatory testing, we've been doing a lot of work with the NCSC, National Cyber Control Sector, Department for Energy, and the industry to upgrade both their defenses against cyber attacks, but as importantly, their resilience to restore services if a cyber attack gets through. And a huge amount of progress has been made over the last few years on both counts. We're very encouraged that the industry is taking the testing and the wargaming and preparations very seriously, and I think we'll continue to work with them to stay on that path.
Do you have any conversations via other government departments around about what's happened in Ukraine, how that energy network's being protected from cyber attack, as obviously it is under near constant cyber and physical attack, as well as other countries where there's been suspected cyber attacks?
So through our cyber teams, we try and learn all of those lessons, and we through NCSC actually we make sure that we make the best of the best practice experience out there.
And would you say you're very confident that the UK network is as secure from cyber attack as it can be?
So yes, but with the caveat that this is a very fast-moving sector, and of course these risks change over time and change quickly.
And just to yourself in particular, Jonathan, Ofgem has said that targeted cyber resilience requirements will be needed for the most significant operators. What determination have you made about who fits in under the most significant operator category? And is it just the big six, or do you need to? Are you looking?
We look at critical national
the national infrastructure, the information is the NIS regulations which govern our role essentially specify a set of operators of essential services. And then even within those, we do prioritize those that could have the biggest impact on the system if there was a failure.
And just on cost, so Ofgem have said that calculations that the average cost of a cyber attack to utilities was about £210,000, with cyber ranking among the top risks across utilities. Who meets those costs?
So in the first
who would
instance,
meet those costs in the instance?
In the first instance, it would be the companies themselves. So I think this is a big commercial driver for a lot of these licensees. And
we've seen similar cyber attacks in the UK where the government had to step in. I'm sure you're aware of what I'm referring to. Is that something that, at what point would you have conversations with utilities to say, with government to determine who meets a large cost? And would that be Ofgem's role, I guess, is the question.
So in a sense, I mean, what we are preoccupied with cybersecurity of the system and of the companies in the system is really around, first and foremost, customer protection. So security of supply and making sure that the companies can still operate. If there were an attack and if there were an economic impact of that attack, I think that's something that we'd have to agree with DESNES and with the companies involved.
It would depend on the case specifics.
And just a very more general question to Fintan and Claire. When it comes to, so Energy UK has suggested that a small investment in modernising NESO systems would deliver billions of pounds in efficiencies, although to be honest, they weren't able to provide details. But when it comes to NESO systems, what modernisation can be conducted and how much of a savings that can be realised?
We've touched on it a couple of times, but we've already been investing in our systems, actually both from a security cyber point of view and from a sort of capability and a capacity point of view. The system is fundamentally changing. So, our world 10 years ago would have been dealing with a very few players, and we could always pick up the phone to them if we needed to. The world in the future is going to be lots more players and a complete digital world. So we're in the transition to full digitisation of our services, which will enable the digitisation across the networks. We've already, as I say, we've already been on that journey. One of the most tangible things to bring out is the updates that we're doing into our control room systems, so where we keep the lights on. The modernisation of the services there have enabled us to increase the utilisation of batteries in the system by 290%.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Sir Christopher. Can I ask you about operating costs? Most people would think it's extraordinary that an electricity company which doesn't collect what it is owed from its customers should receive some sort of compensation allowance from the regulator. Why do we allow? Why do you permit that? Why don't you require energy companies to fund any debts, failure to collect what's owed to them, out of their profits?
Well, you have to understand what the allowances we make are within the price cap. And so, in a sense, when a company issues a fixed rate, it includes all of its costs within that and makes its own calculation. But within the price cap, what we have to do and what the legislation requires us to do is to identify reasonable and efficient costs and to make sure that those are fairly reflected. And in any business, particularly in energy, there is always going to be a cost of debt that ultimately isn't paid. So for us, in a sense, it's a calculation of what we think a reasonable company should be charging, should be incurring in cost, and then reflecting that back with a regulated margin for the price. So, in other markets, you don't have a regulated price, therefore you don't have this kind of calculation being made by the regulator. But they still exist in the price that's charged.
You make this extra allowance. If they're recovering the costs, then they should from their consumers. If the consumers are paying their bills, then that's good, and the more efficient companies collecting the money will make perhaps larger profits or not such large losses. But the idea that all this should be pooled and be another burden on every other customer, it seems to me when we're trying to reduce the costs of bills, the headline costs of electricity, why are we burdening those bills with this? Is there not another way of doing it in the way that I've described? I mean, if you go to Sainsbury's and you hear that there's a lot of shrinkage, and you see that the security guards allow people to walk out without challenging them with large amounts of meat that they haven't paid for, then you may think twice about whether they're going to go back to Sainsbury's, because they're obviously that's included in their prices. And you're doing something similar. You're adding to the costs, the inefficiency that comes out of the companies that are not collecting the money. And another example would be if you're collecting council tax from a local authority. Local authority is not given an allowance for people who've got arrears of council tax. So if you removed from the bills this particular item, then it would save everybody a significant amount.
So what we do through the price cap calculation is we give every company the average cost in the market. That does not change their incentives at all. So those who collect more will do better, and exactly as you say, we'll make greater profits or fewer losses as a result. But in any business, including for councils and for supermarkets, there is always an allowance made in accounts for people who don't pay, and that is part of the ongoing cost of the business, and the legislation requires that we reflect that.
But your policy on this has contributed to an exponential increase in the debts, the unpaid bills. Remind me of how many billions of pounds are now owed by customers who haven't on their electricity bills. It's
about
5 billion, 7 billion,
about £4.5 billion.
£4.5 billion pounds. So if you required those companies to recover what's owed to them, okay, without giving them a subsidy, then surely we'd be able to reduce the total, the extraordinarily high sum of money to be owing. And it's related, of course, to us having these extraordinarily high electricity costs, which the government promised to bring down, but which has failed to deliver on.
I think we should be clear. We are concerned about the level of debt in the market. I think the way we would approach it is we need to, the reason we want to launch the debt relief scheme is because we want to make sure that we can bring down that stock of debt, and also for the customers who are in debt, this is an extremely difficult position. But also we want to make sure that companies have the tools in place to be able to recover the funding. I think where we differ is we think that the companies do have an economic incentives to recover money, because ultimately the amount they get in the price cap is fixed, the amount they recover is variable depending on their behaviour, and happy to follow up with more detail on that. I agree that there is an issue. I think we have a different approach to trying to resolve it.
Right. Have I misunderstood it then? If you receive an electricity bill, and it's subject to the price cap, are you saying that the company is not allowed to put onto the extra bill the costs of unpaid arrears?
What we calculate for everybody is the average cost across the market. If you have company A that is good at recovering funding, they will do better than that allowance and they will be able to make more money. So they have an incentive still to do so. And company B, who is doing worse in collecting that revenue, will do worse than that and will face a loss or lower profits. So the incentives on the company are the same. But yes, we do allow and make an allowance for bad debt, because that is a cost that companies incur.
They've all been doing really badly, haven't they? You're giving them these incentives, but over the years, the cost of the amount of debt has gone up to, you say, £4.5 billion, £4,500 million.
And we have to recognise that is partly because the prices have been so high and much higher than they have been historically. So we agree there's more to do here, but we don't think that removing the debt allowance is the way to tackle it.
So you don't think this is indulging a sort of can't pay, won't pay culture, which is what we had when people didn't like paying the community charge? Or if you have the local authorities have enormous powers to take people to court, to confiscate their goods and so on if they don't pay the council tax. Why shouldn't electricity companies be using similar powers which are available to recover the unpaid debts instead of passing that burden to the good payers?
So I think there are three things we think we need to do to bring down debt. So first of all, when you look into the detail of how debt occurs and when it becomes unmanageable for companies and for customers, accurate billing is critical. Interacting with customers early when they get into payment difficulties is also critical. Secondly, we do accept actually there is more work for us to do with the industry on how collection is made. We know, a few years ago we had, extreme trouble around the forced installation of prepayment meters, and we've worked hard with the industry to move that to a different place. But thirdly, we do think, given there is a stock of debt that has grown for customers since the crisis, there is a need to bring in schemes like our debt relief scheme to bring customers back into a conversation with the companies about how they get into a better place, but also to reduce that debt.
Before you do, and you'll remember, Christopher, we made recommendations on how to clear the debt, which is to get the network companies to pay for it, which Ofgem didn't accept.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and we are, we did, as I said, we accepted half of it.
So if the government said that the electricity companies should be given the responsibility for collecting their own debts, no? And there shouldn't be a levy that everybody else would have to pay, what would be the consequence of that change?
So electricity companies do have the responsibility for collecting their debts, but every company in every sector, including in energy, will always have a residual bad debt. That is what we reflect through the price cap. If we took that away, the economics of the companies simply wouldn't stack up, and you'd find we're back in a world that we're in 22 of companies not being able to fund themselves and therefore going insolvent.
You describe these things as bad debts. But if they were bad debts, they could be written off.
Yes.
In elementary accounting, if you've got a bad debt and an irrecoverable debt, you write it off. What we're talking about, though, a lot of this £4.5 billion is recoverable debt.
Yeah, quite. And so, but what is reflected on bills is the accounting estimate of that bad debt. It's not all of the debts that get socialised. It's just the debt that cannot be recovered.
Thank you. Which moves us neatly on to the remaining questions from Vera are firstly on profits and allowances, and then on paying for non-commodity costs and the Ofgem energy system cost review. Vera.
Well, indeed. So how much profits are energy companies allowed to make before they actually sort of push their costs onto consumer bills, but they are making quite a lot of profits that we don't really see. We heard that there might be as much as £500 per household in profits across the energy system. Could Ofgem be more transparent on where these profits are being made and which parts of the bill they are impacting on?
So we are really clear on the profits for the companies that we regulate. So as I mentioned, the retailers have a regulated margin. We monitor that very closely, and as I say, they are at or have been at or below that in the last few years. We also, and actually we'll be happy to talk about how we think about the returns that network companies make.
Do you recognise the figures? £500 per household bill?
So I think they are, the Unite report adds up some areas of the industry that we regulate and have information on, and some areas where we don't have information. So gas producers, for instance, almost certainly have made a lot of profit, particularly through the crisis period, which is why the government introduced the windfall tax on them. But they are not regulated. We don't regulate the oil and gas sector. So we simply do not have any information on oil production profits. We have good information on energy retail profits. That's about £42 within the price cap per year. And we have pretty good information on the network companies that we regulate. Network charges in the price cap are about £400 in all, and about a third of that would be operating profit. So something like £130 would be operating profit. The one thing I would say in relation to the Unite report, which came up with that 500 figure, is that it can be incredibly misleading to add up the profit numbers across such disparate industries. And that the reason for that is that any capital-intensive industry, like generation, energy generation, or energy networks, will always have a high operating profit margin because they have to pay interest on the debt and pay back the capital, the equity capital that is going into their business. Whereas a non-capital intensive sector like energy retail will typically have quite low operating profit margins. So that's why we don't measure profitability in networks, for instance, by operating profit margin. We look at the return on the capital that is employed, and that is very tightly regulated by Ofgem.
So what did you say? How much profit did the networks make between 2021 and 25?
So you quoted a £500 figure from the price cap. I think that's the £500 out of a price cap of, say, 1,700. That was the Unite figure, I think, that you quoted. And I was saying that we recognize £42 of that is the retail profit. That's
we had different evidence from different people, and some people were saying, oh, do I recognize that? So it seems to me not very clear at all. And since it does impact very much on consumer bills, first of all, shouldn't there be much more transparency? How much profits are actually made, A, by the generator or by the networks? How much is it? Why is it so complicated to actually give the consumer or the bill payer a very accurate figure of what profits are actually being made?
We regularly publish the profit numbers for the companies that we regulate, for the retailers as well as the network companies. We don't price regulate the power generation sector. And we used to collect segmental accounts. We used to require them to send us segmental accounts for their UK businesses to look at revenues and profitability. But in an effort to try and reduce the administrative burden, the regulatory burden that we are putting on the sector, we agreed to stop collecting that information. And we don't regulate the oil and gas production sector at all. So we simply don't have any information on that.
Should we? Should we?
So I think the point is that's an international market. So if we should, it's a body bigger than Ofgem that would need to do it. I mean, this is about international trade. Not that I'm trying to limit Ofgem's ambition and capability.
Was that a bid for additional?
There's an Ofgem review out, Chair, so I'll add that to the ask list.
But again, so are you confident from everything that we have heard that there won't be in future excess energy sector profits?
I think you have to recognise, it comes back to what I said in the opening statement, that, as we rely on global markets, remember our electricity market is linked to Europe as well as our gas market. These prices are going to be set outside the control of Ofgem, outside the control of the UK government, and those prices, as I believe, will continue to be volatile while we are in the sort of geopolitical station we've been in. So
we are particularly talking about the network charges,
okay,
the network and profits. So I want to know more about that sort of network costs and the profits that the network.
Fine. Well, on the gas, the answer is no. But on networks,
the networks we are very transparent on. So £400 is the network charge on the price cap out of the £1,700 price cap. £400 is the network charge, and about a third of that 400 is interest and dividends, the cost of capital, the returns to investors. So about 130 out of the 400 would be the operating profit element. But I'm very keen to stress, Ms. Hobbs, that figure, if you compare that figure, for instance, to the retail figure of £42, you might say, why are the networks making a bigger operating profit than the energy retailers? And the reason for that is that the networks are very capital intensive businesses, so they have to pay a much bigger interest on their debt and returns to their shareholders as compared to the energy retailers.
Should that be itemized on your bill, particularly to explain that to customers? Because rising energy bills are obviously a big political thing. Should that not be explained better? And what particular part of the charge is, the profit?
I mean, one of the things we're doing that the chair referred to right now is a cost allocation and recovery review, and one important strand of that piece of work is transparency in how costs are communicated to customers. And I think you do have a point. I think if we are all bill payers in this room, if we all look at our energy bill, the energy sector is fiendishly complicated to get your head around. And I think we want to take a bit of time to think through what kind of presentation and communication will be most useful for customers, particularly domestic customers. If you get a bill with a lot of itemization of detail, that in itself can be quite confusing and quite overwhelming.
Some people might be interested.
So what we do though is, on every price cap we publish a breakdown of the price cap and the categories that are within it, and they are broad categories. So that includes retail, that includes the regulated retail profit, for example, what's paid on networks, what's paid on policy, etc.
So on the consultation that you've been talking about earlier, and forgive me if I didn't quite hear it. So first of all, it's coming soon. Is that correct? At pace? Will you consult on policy options on energy systems cost allocation and recovery?
Yeah, perhaps I'll kick off, and then actually you may want to come in. So we are planning to publish a policy consultation, so a further consultation building on the call for input that we issued last year. In a sense, the way we are charging for this system is changing automatically. The cost base is changing. So come back to some of the earlier questions. It is true that as you transition away from gas, you are moving away from commodity costs, which are variable, and you are moving to a larger set of fixed costs. So network costs, and indeed, in a sense, once renewables are built, in effect, they are fixed costs, fixed costs that we are applying to the system. So what we are trying to do with the cost allocation review is to find the best way to allocate that. And there are really two dimensions we're looking at. So first of all, by allocating cost in a particular way, can you make the system more efficient? So coming back to my colleague talking about time of day, for example, if we encourage people to use it differently, that will make a difference. But the second question, which is why we are doing this closely with government, is how do you allocate those costs fairly and reasonably? Accepting, as we know, that the energy system itself and energy use is not very progressive, and some of these costs will have a bigger impact on lower incomes. So what we'd like to do next is begin to test some of our emerging hypotheses, and then have a clearer direction about the way in which we might make this change, and that will come into a longer term answer to some of the questions we've had around standing charges. So we are expecting soon to be able to come out and talk about that.
And to what extent can Ofgem actually mandate how the burden of cost is shuffled around, while still allowing retailers flexibility in recovering costs and discretion?
So what this review is principally looking at is how we manage the costs that come into a retailer, because quite often, particularly in a volatile market, retailers reflect those costs in the bills that they charge. So in a sense, we are looking at, in a sense, at the network charging formulae that the system operator administers on our behalf, and how that goes into retailers. But we find that when we make changes to the underlying cost base, that usually is passed on through the retailers because that's the best way they manage their risks. Actually, I don't think I've anything.
So at this stage, we're not proposing to mandate tariffs for the retailers. I think our concern, as Jonathan says, is to make sure that we send efficient signals to the retailers for efficient use of the network and efficient use of the generation in the system, and that we distribute the costs across households in a fairer way. I think we had an unprecedented response. 30,000 people responded to our consultation on standing charges and said that they didn't think that the existing way of distributing those costs, which is to have all households pay an equal share, an equal payment, they didn't consider that as fair. So we're going to think about alternative ways that you could distribute these costs. For instance, they could be according to capacity, the peak of the demand, how much current you draw every year from the grid. It could be by reference to the volume of use, how much consumption you have every year. Or indeed, it could be to some extent related to the ability to pay, and that is where we're going to need to work very closely with the government.
Indeed. So we always talk about digital literacy. So some people are really interested, and they sort of say, all right, I put my washing machine on now, or even have a remote signal to put it on when energy costs are low. But not everybody is that way inclined, and particularly more vulnerable households are not going to do that. So in which ways can they be protected from just the guys who really are digitally literate, and they're usually the better off people anyway? How can they be protected from just falling down on that particular part, balance of the argument?
Yeah, so I can't give you a very precise answer, but I think our basic idea is that at least in the beginning, it is a good thing to give people the choice. So if people can voluntarily offer flexibility and get rewarded for that, that is how we start to create a mass interest in this field, and we, as long as we send the right kind of incentives for the retailers, the supply companies, to try to automate that as much as possible. So you take the hassle out of that for households. We really don't think that energy should be so complicated, and that if you have to get your head around lots and lots of technical rules, then most people won't take it up. So it has to be automatic and simple, and at least for in the starting period, it should be largely voluntary, so that you don't impose it on everybody, don't penalize people that can't offer flexibility, but we do reward the people that can.
Well, I've been talking to some onshore wind developers, and the point they've made to me is that they have to work out where's the best wind, but they've also got to take into account constraints, areas of natural beauty, outstanding natural beauty, not clashing with aviation in particular. What is NESO's approach? What evaluation do you make of where developers should build, where it's viable for them to build?
So we don't, at a granular sort of this field and not that field, do it. But one of the key new roles that we're taking on is around the regional energy strategic planning role. And that involves working in each of the regions, and we've broken Scotland, Wales and England up into 11 different regions. So working with the key stakeholders in that region, that is the distribution network company, the gas distribution company, local authorities, but also energy developers within that network, to make sure that we are developing a network, an energy plan for that region that is consistent with overall national policy objectives, but also the ambition of that region and the individual players within it. So that provides the opportunity to convene the right people and to identify where there are opportunities for example, onshore wind, if you like. I think the move towards Clean Power 2030, and indeed the future sort of evolution of that towards strategic spatial energy planning, we are getting more, and by we I mean GB plc is getting more definitive around where it wants to see different technologies develop. So if you look at government sort of Clean Power 2030 action plan, it set out for each major technology type, so for offshore wind, for onshore wind, for each part of Great Britain, how much capacity of onshore wind did it think needed to be developed. So we think that through the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, we will continue to refine that type of advice into government. So that will help individual developers take a view as to, okay, this is a region where actually there's a huge opportunity for onshore wind. And those evaluations will take into account sort of conditions on the ground, what's coming out of those regional energy use plans, deliverability, so community acceptability of infrastructure, and natural resources and constraints through the environment through that. So through both the regional planning and the strategic spatial energy planning, I think individual developers will be getting more sort of advice and guidance on where the system sees different technologies develop over the medium term.
Yes, and that guidance, will it pick up the kinds of challenges around geographical location, or to what extent? I mean, you touched on this bunch, but just want to pin you down a little bit. You know, in the SSEP, for example, will it pick up the needs of aviation, the challenge of where a wind farm can be in relation to radar, for example?
Yeah, so it should pick up all of the sort of major environmental or planning constraints that sort of define areas of significant natural beauty, or places where you just cannot build something, including where there are restrictions for defence reasons or radar reasons. So yes, and that is a significant evolution in how we do strategic planning from what's done today.
Okay, thank you. Vera.
Actually, just coming back to an earlier point about constraint costs and batteries, and I'm sort of trying to get my head around how one could think about it. So you said there's a balance between, is it actually worth building out the network, and that costs so much money, and we'd rather sort of occasionally pay off the generators for not running their wind turbines. But what would it look like if a battery system was attached to, let's say, a big wind farm that could take off the pressure for that moment when the wires get too hot? What would be the cost calculations or benefits if there was energy storage directly attached to those? And therefore, for example, when you have a planning application for, let's say, a very large solar farm plus a battery storage, which I hear now is being delayed, which looks a little bit silly because it might actually mean it's a benefit to the system. How should one look at battery storage in that context?
So I think battery storage is hugely, in general, beneficial to the system. Right? It's an incredibly flexible asset. It can absorb power when needed, and it can inject it back into the system. And you see, and also its cost trajectory is coming down, right? So batteries today are significantly cheaper than they were a number of years ago. And you see, therefore, that actually developers are doing exactly what you say. So the number of hybrid projects that are out there is increasing as developers see that actually I have a onshore wind farm. If I connect a battery storage facility to it, that thing is more valuable. I can offer more firm power. I can sell different. So that is happening. From a system operator's point of view, we also see that there are locations where actually having batteries on the system allows us to manage constraints in a more active manner, in a cheaper manner as well. So there
could retrofit batteries, if you wish, retrofit in terms of where you have a lot of constraint costs, or where you can see that the system. Often you have to turn a wind turbine off, and Graham is no longer in the room, but he's sort of talking about the anger that people feel that their wind turbines are there but they don't operate. Could you not retrofit, rather than sort of building out the network, which might be very expensive? Could you not sort of retrofit a battery storage there?
So if it would solve the constraint problem, you could. The issue tends to be that once the battery's full up, it's full up, and then the constraint manifests itself in any event. And when you look at the sheer scale of electrons that and power that needs to be moved from North Sea, offshore North Sea, down to southeast of England, batteries are not the solution in that you actually need the wires to move the power. So there are circumstances where batteries can be helpful in minimising constraints, and we do look at actively deploying them in that way. But the mass deployment of them to sort of offset large-scale network infrastructure is not going to work in that circumstance.
Okay. Thank you very much for your evidence this afternoon. That is the end of our session. I'm sure there are a few things to follow up in writing on, which you will do as you always have. Thank you again. End of the session. Order.